Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian, former NFL scout and currently at Sports Info Solutions, joined as always by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. Aaron, we are heading down the stretch in December. Let's take a December reset and take a look at the playoff picture heading down the stretch. What do you see right now when you look at the league and we head down into the last month of the season?
Well, for the most part, it looks like the division leaders are pretty ensconced in their places, but there are a couple of divisions that are pretty up for grabs at this point. I mean, Baltimore is only a half game behind Pittsburgh for various reasons. We think Pittsburgh is heavily favored, but that's close. And of course, Dallas and Philly, we'll get to this later in the podcast. Their game this week is absolutely huge for who's going to win the NFC East. I ran a simulation in our playoff odds simulations. 59% of the time, one of the current 8 division leaders does not win its division. So things are not quite as solidified as you might think. There may still be some change, but I think that the division leaders, if they fall out of the number one spots in their divisions, they're probably still going to get wild cards, the exception being Dallas, because the tiebreakers don't work out very well for Dallas. It's one of the reasons the Dallas-Philly game is so big this week, is the tiebreakers for wild cards don't work out very well for those teams, so they really need to win the NFC East.
Yeah, you mentioned those two divisions that are obviously very close, the Steelers, Ravens, and then the Cowboys ahead of the Eagles and the Redskins, but we really think that those leaders are going to win those divisions, and we'll talk more about them later. One to keep an eye on that's kind of sneaky interesting is the AFC West, where the Chargers are still a game behind the Chiefs. Obviously, they've lost one against them earlier in the year, and they've got to travel to Kansas City and try to steal a game there. But if they do that, they look identical in a lot of ways, and I think the Chargers could come for the Chiefs in that division.
I mean, the tough thing for that is just both teams have pretty difficult schedules down the stretch. So a big part of it is just winning that game, winning in Kansas City for the Chargers without losing other games.
Actually, you know what? I take that back. The Chargers have 2 division losses and the Chiefs have none. The Chiefs would still be in the driver's seat even at that point.
Oh, so that's why we're favoring the Chiefs so heavily in that division then, because we have them winning the division 90% of the time.
Yep, makes sense. And they should be heavy favorites in that game. They have a really good home field advantage, which we'll talk about as we get a little bit later. We talked about a little bit how the league's kind of haves and have-nots right now, and it's made a few of the games the last couple of weeks a little bit boring, not going to lie about that. But the playoffs should really be awesome. I think there are at least 5 real contenders in each conference, and the top 4 teams across, the top 2 in each conference is looking at the Chiefs and the Patriots and the Rams and the Saints. Those teams look really good, and we could have an exciting playoff picture.
There's very good teams, and I mean, don't sleep. The problem with the Chargers is they're going to have to go on the road because they're probably going to be a wild card. But that team is really, really good, really balanced, top 10 on our ratings in both offense and defense, and they've climbed up to number 3 overall. They actually passed the Saints in our ratings this week because of the Saints losing to the Cowboys.
Very interesting. And the Chargers, if anybody, should be accustomed to playing on the road because pretty much every game they've played this year has been a road game.
Yeah, that's one of the things is like trying to figure out if there is such a thing as home field advantage for the Chargers. The thing is, two years is not really enough time to figure out whether their home field advantage is smaller than usual. But it theoretically, subjectively, it sure seems like playing a game at the Chargers is much more of a neutral site game.
Right, you're not going to get like you would have in Arrowhead, for example, that crazy home field, loud crowd advantage. There, it's going to be more split, half and half, and depending who they play. They played in Pittsburgh. I wonder if Pittsburgh had played in LA last week, if there would have been more Steelers fans. I'd bet on it.
Yeah, I mean, this is every game for the Chargers is like this, is trying to figure out which fans are going to outnumber the other fans and how many Chargers fans are even going to show up. And, I mean, I know this is going to become a big deal because in the AFC North battle, right, the Steelers have to play the Saints and the Patriots, but at least they get the Patriots at home. The Ravens have to play the Chiefs and the Chargers, and both games are on the road, except is the Chargers a road game or not, right? Like, should we be counting that as a road game? It's kind of hard to tell.
Right. Well, they do have to take the cross-country flight, so sort of. So on that topic, let's go right back into the big games that we talked about last week, and one of them was that Pittsburgh-Los Angeles Clippers, as you called them.
Hey, when you see LAC in the notes, you still think Los Angeles Clippers.
I prefer it. I think we should just go with calling them the Clippers. I think it's better that way.
You've got your New York Football Giants and your Los Angeles Football Clippers.
So the Clip Show with a big comeback victory leaves Pittsburgh just a half game up on the Ravens, as we started to talk about, and now everybody's finally starting to take notice of the Chargers. What was your big takeaway watching that game?
Again, just that the Chargers are a really strong, balanced team that can do pretty much everything, run, pass, both offense and defense. Obviously, special teams have been a problem for them in the past, but they weren't this week because they got the big punt return touchdown. But, I think that the Chargers are a dangerous team. The problem is that they're going to have to go on the road in the playoffs.
Yep, super dangerous, and we saw the emergence of another running back in their backfield while Melvin Gordon's out. So great comeback there for Phil Rivers, who's, like we've said before, having an unbelievable season. Going around the league, another big game that we broke down last week was between Washington and Philadelphia. The Colt McCoy injury seems to have closed the book on the Washington season, which is something that I don't think we ever thought we would say.
Yes, because we never thought that the book was even going to be open on the Washington season to begin with, but it was, and it still kind of is. Here's the amazing thing, is that even though in our simulations we've got Washington now as the second worst team in the league with the third string quarterback, they still make the playoffs 12% of the time because, as we learned from Arizona Green Bay, the worst team in the league can pull an upset, right? This is not college football where the worst team gets blown out by 40 points. Upsets happen. So it is possible that Washington could make the playoffs, but it's not really likely.
On the other side of that one, the Eagles-Cowboys matchup that will be coming this coming week. We'll obviously talk about that later in the episode. Going to have huge playoff implications there. The final game that we talked about, Minnesota and New England, you were there. The Patriots look very tough to beat when Gordon, Gronk, and Edelman are all healthy. What did you notice? What were your takeaways from that game?
Yeah, I was surprised for a lot of the game. We just didn't understand why the Patriots weren't throwing the ball downfield more, given that the Vikings were down their top two cornerbacks, right? Trey Waynes was out in the concussion protocol, and Xavier Rhodes played every other series for some reason. And he shut down Josh Gordon when he was in. Xavier Rhodes, Josh Gordon had like one small catch on a smoke route, that was the only thing he caught against Xavier Rhodes. All the other stuff he caught was either against zones or against other cornerbacks. But at the end of the day, it turned out, the Patriots controlled the game. Even though they weren't throwing downfield, they controlled it pretty much, especially in the second half. That was their best game of the season by DVOA for the New England Patriots.
Yeah, it's always interesting when you can actually see the game in the stadium, in person. You get, obviously, to watch the routes develop down the field, which I wish we could do on TV more often. But also noticing those substitution patterns, I think, is a big part of being there.
And even then, when you're there, you have to pick something to concentrate on, right? Like when the Patriots were on offense, I spent a lot of time looking at how the Vikings were using their cornerbacks. But when you do that, you can't look at the offensive line and defensive line, right? You can't look at what the quarterback is doing. You still have to have your eyes in only one place. That's the thing about football, is that you can't concentrate on everything at the same time.
So have you read Steve Belichick's Football Scouting Methods, Bill Belichick's father's book?
I have not.
So this is a really fascinating book because now it's also very boring if you're not really into the weeds on football like we are. But the book really describes how to watch the game from a scouting perspective and where to start your eyes on each play and what shortcuts you can use to start to understand what the defense is doing, what the offense is doing, and kind of like the most quick way to understand really what's going on schematically, what the chess match is showing on the field. It's really fascinating stuff. He talks about things like by looking at everybody lined up in between the guards at the line of scrimmage, you can really start to extrapolate a lot of things about what the front is doing there going on. By checking for the single high, two high look on the back end, you can figure out a lot about where the coverages are going based on that. It all fits in together. So high recommendation for me. It's one of my favorite football books of all time. Pains me to say because I grew up with my heart being broken by Bill Belichick on a regular basis. But fascinating book right there. And you reminded me of it because it's a real great skill that some coaches have, some scouts have, where they can really concentrate on more than one thing at one time, or that the way that and it sounds like you tend to do it, you can really zone in on one thing and get a really good read on that and then go back and watch the film and you can look at some other things. Book recommendations aside, Let's take a quick break. Let's do an ad read, and then we'll come back in with the big games for this week. The Off the Charts Football Podcast is brought to you by the Sports Info Solutions Data Hub, located at sisdatahub.com. With the SIS Data Hub, our elite team of researchers and video scouts have worked together to create a revolutionary interactive tool. The SIS Data Hub gives you countless layers of customizable filters to account for any factors imaginable. The SIS Data Hub is also the only place to view exclusive proprietary statistics, like points added, positive play percentage, and independent quarterback rating. By combining this with the ability for the user to add an unlimited number of filters based on SIS charting data, including all kinds of things like air yards, blown blocks, man-zone splits, pressure rate, fronts data, and more, the SIS Data Hub is a trusted tool for coaches, scouts, and media, and it could be yours too. Right now, for a limited time, you can get a free 1-week trial to this revolutionary database when you go to sisdatahub.com and register for an account. That's sisdatahub.com. Coming right back in with the biggest games of this week. Aaron, we've got a big front runner for the biggest game of the week in terms of playoff odds. What do we have there?
Yeah, this is the biggest game of the year so far as which team is going to make it to the playoffs, not for the Super Bowl, but for the playoffs. And that is Dallas-Philadelphia. With a win, Dallas makes the playoffs 98% of the time. 97% of the time, that's winning the NFC East. If they lose, they're only in the playoffs 49% of the time. Philadelphia, 59% of the time with the win, and they become the NFC East favorites. Only 7% of the time with a loss. It's just the way that the tiebreakers are in the NFC does not work out well for either Dallas or Philadelphia, in particular because, first of all, whoever loses this game, especially if Philadelphia loses this game, they're basically going to have to win the other three in order to stay ahead of Minnesota. And they already have a head-to-head loss against Carolina, and they're probably not going to pass Seattle. So they really need to win the NFC East in order to make the playoffs.
Yeah, you laid out the stakes. They're pretty clear. Dallas wins. They're probably winning the division, and Philadelphia is almost completely done. If Philadelphia wins, Philadelphia is slightly into the driver's seat in the division, and an outside chance that both those teams could make the playoffs.
Very outside, because even if Philadelphia wins, Dallas is only a wild card 12% of simulations. They also are going to have a hard time winning a wild card. You really need to win this NFC East.
Which is justice, because it has been the NFC least. I'm looking at a couple of the receivers in this game. First one is Amari Cooper, and what the Amari Cooper trade has meant for the Cowboys season. Through the first 7 games, the Cowboys had just 6.3 total points from receiving per game. Total points being our division of credit metric here at SIS. Amari Cooper individually for the Raiders had just 1 receiving total point per game. Fast forward, and over the 5 games since being traded, Amari has gone off for 4.6 total points per game alone, up from just 1. And the Cowboys team average has jumped to 10 receiving total points per game, up from 6.3. So Amari Cooper's impact has been huge on the Cowboys passing game. And I think when we looked at that trade, I think we still feel like the price is a little bit high, but Amari Cooper has balled out playing with Dak Prescott.
Absolutely has been fantastic, and he was a big part of the first game when Dallas beat Philadelphia that first game. I can't remember if that was his first or second game with the Cowboys, but it was pretty early on in his time with the Cowboys. The other thing that happened in the first game was Ezekiel Elliott had 19 carries for 151 yards and a touchdown. He had runs of 32 and 35 yards. And that highlights a big problem for the Eagles, which is that they rank dead last in open field yards per carry, which measures gains by running backs that come more than 10 yards past the line of scrimmage. And they're 29th in the league in the SIS charting in percentage of plays where they've had broken tackles on defense. So the tackling has got to improve if the Eagles want to pull this upset.
Yeah, as we pointed out, the Eagles really just haven't played that well. They're coming off a couple of wins, but against a couple of kind of weak opponents. And I'm sorry, just as you bring up Ezekiel Elliott, it made me think of with Reuben Foster and Kareem Hunt this week. Ezekiel Elliott was fined for his $21 in the Salvation Army bucket. Thank you, NFL. Thank you. We appreciate that. Looking at the other side, when the Eagles have the ball, I'm looking at Zach Ertz. He's having a historic year, and I think it's kind of been a little bit quiet in a way. His 93 receptions are just 17 behind Jason Witten's record for most receptions in a season by a tight end. and he's on pace for 124, which would easily pass Witten's mark and put him at 5th all-time amongst all receivers. He's got 978 yards on the season, which puts him on pace for over 1,300 and just 23 yards off the pace of Gronkowski's 1,327-yard season in 2011. Zach Ertz is having a ridiculous year, despite some of the struggles that the Eagles have had on offense and in general.
Yeah, and in the first matchup with the Cowboys, he had a ridiculous game. Caught 14 of 16 for 145 yards, 2 touchdowns. The Cowboys have been below average against tight ends, but that is the worst game that they've given up to a tight end this year by far. And we'll see whether Ertz can do it again this week. But, yeah, he's phenomenal. He's a phenomenal player having a phenomenal year and a huge part of that offense.
And in defense of Carson Wentz, who's been heavily criticized this year, his numbers are actually pretty comparable to his MVP. Was he the MVP runner-up last year?
I think at the end he was the runner-up.
He's been comparable, if not better, in all areas except touchdown percentage when you kind of break down his stat line. His completion percentage is up by 10 percentage points. He was at 60% last year, up to 70%. His yards per attempt and per game are both up this year. But the touchdown percentage was at 7.5% in 2017 and is all the way down to 4.9% this year. That's made the biggest difference in certainly the perception of him. And we know these touchdowns can be sort of a small sample size thing, but I think that nobody would argue that he's taken a step off the pace this year.
Remember, last year he was ridiculously, historically good in the red zone. And this year, Philadelphia's offense is 21st in the red zone.
Right. And we always talk about, red zone performance from year to year is often not reliable. Yeah. Biggest thing I'm looking at, though, and the biggest thing that I think has contributed to the red zone struggles, because show me a team that can run the ball in the red zone, and I'll show you a good red zone team. The running game of the Eagles has really stunk since J.J. was injured in Week 5. Since that time, as a team, they average 4 yards per attempt, tied for 28th in the league, 98 yards per game, 29th in the league, and a broken tackle percentage of just 5.8 per 100 carries, just 26th in the league. They've really struggled at the running back position. And that running game, when you don't have that there, it makes things a lot harder to execute in the pass game when you get the short field in the red zone.
It's interesting. Now, the only thing that kind of saves that for the Eagles is that the Cowboys are worse in the red zone than they are. The Cowboys are 31st in offensive DVOA in the red zone, including dead last passing the ball. They were actually pretty good in the red zone in the first game between these teams, but over the course of the season, they have been very bad in the red zone.
One thing I want to just talk about from a not stats perspective, but a football perspective, the Cowboys made a change in offensive line coach. And to me, that's made the biggest difference that we've seen with them this year. Their offense really, I know we talked about Amari Cooper and the way that he came in, but their offensive line really seems to be clicking in a different way. And I guess the story coming out of there is that the coach that they had this season was doing things differently than the way the guys have been doing things in the past, the way that they like to do things. Get him out of there, and they took one of the former players who's now the offensive line coach. The name's escaping.
Colombo, I believe.
Yeah, Mark Colombo, right.
Colombo.
And they seem like they're back to that Cowboys, 2016 offensive line form. If that can carry through, that's the thing that I think makes the Cowboys really scary to me. Even more so than, the play of the linebackers was great last week. They've certainly got some great athletes on the defensive line, rushing the passer. But the offensive line, I think, is where everything starts and stops for this team and for Dak Prescott, and on and on. All right, I'll get off my soapbox and we can move ahead. What is the next most important game of the week for playoff odds?
Well, speaking of interesting offensive lines, Minnesota and Seattle, Monday Night Football. Seattle is in 98% of the time with a win, 82% with a loss. Minnesota, 83% with a win, 45% with a loss. So it's a really big game for Minnesota.
Yeah, the Seahawks have all of a sudden creeped up to that 7-5 record, and they've kind of put themselves in a really good position for the playoffs. Even with the loss, they'd still be at 82% by your odds, which is kind of interesting to me, thinking about what we thought of this team a few weeks ago. You mentioned the offensive lines in this game, and certainly a different offensive line in Seattle this year. Same old offensive line in Minnesota, though, it would appear. They're still having struggles up front, and that might be their Achilles heel this season.
Yeah, rushing the ball has been terrible this year for the Vikings. They are dead last, I believe, in run DVOA and 31st in adjusted line yards.
Ouch. That really hurts. What do you think of the Seattle improvement? What's been going on behind that you've seen as they've crept up that DVOA leaderboard and the standings?
It's offense. I mean, the defense has settled down a bit. The defense actually was rated better a few weeks ago, and the defense has done it a lot with takeaways, which is harder to, keep going over a long period of time. But their offense is up to 10th in the league. So things have been really good on offense. It's fairly balanced between the run and the pass. Strong offensive game is what's really built it for them. And the offensive line has improved dramatically this year with the new offensive line coach rather than having Tom Cable around. Is it Mike Solari is his name, I believe? And yeah, that's been a real improvement for them. And so the whole offense has improved. Tyler Lockett is having a fantastic season as the number 2 receiver. We should add that in also. I believe he's number 1 in the league in receiving DVOA.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I think there's been a lot of talk about the Vikings wide receivers this year, about Adam Thielen, people talking about him being a top 10 wide receiver when he had the 8 straight 100-yard receiving games to start the year. But some really great research from Pat Rowley here. And as always, shout out to Patrick for his great research throughout the show. A few weeks back, we noted that when they played the Lions, Diggs was out. And so Thielen only had 4 catches for 22 yards against Detroit. But in the 3 games since, Diggs has been on the field, and Thielen has still struggled relative to how he was doing. He has 66, 125, and 28 yards in those 3 games, averaging just 73 yards per game. Meanwhile, Tyler Lockett has gotten really hot over that same time period. He ranks number 1 with a perfect receiver ratings, which is quarterback rating when targeted, 158.3 when Tyler Lockett's targeted over that time. How do you get there? 22 targets, 19 receptions on 19 catchable balls, 3 touchdowns. Not a volume guy by Thielen, but he's been as efficient as they come as that number 2 target like you're talking about.
Yeah, now it'll be interesting to see because Minnesota, I believe, still will have no Trey Waynes, but they will have Xavier Rhodes fully back. So does Xavier Rhodes cover Doug Baldwin or does Xavier Rhodes cover Lockett?
We got to look out for it. So even though we said, we're talking about 19 catches over the last 5 games, so it's not like he's putting up, that's under 4 catches per game. So it's hard to take the attention and put it on him. But, I mean, if he keeps crushing it, then it's going to be hard not to. Let's take it around the league for the final game that we'll talk about this week. What is the most important game of the week for Super Bowl odds?
Most important game of the week for Super Bowl odds is Baltimore and Kansas City. Baltimore, 4.1% of the time they're in the Super Bowl with a win, 1.9% of the time with a loss. Kansas City, we have them at 50% with a win, 40.6% of the time with the loss. Also, Baltimore, their playoff odds, this is a huge game for their playoff odds. They make the playoffs 83% of the time if they win, 44% of the time if they lose. And I've got to start with a really interesting stat because I looked up Kansas City is the worst run defense in the league, right? So Baltimore has played this extremely run-focused offense since they brought in Lamar Jackson as the starting quarterback. So I went to see what happens when they face quarterback runs, right? Because we don't want to just look at running back runs. What if we take the quarterback runs and separate them? Kansas City has faced fewer quarterback runs this year than any other defense. Only 15, including scrambles. But they've allowed 100 yards on those 15 runs, which I don't think tells us much, but it's a really interesting stat. I think what it tells us is that we have no idea how they're going to do against Lamar Jackson. Are they going to be as bad against him as they are against running backs, or are they going to be better? We don't know because we haven't seen them face running quarterbacks this year.
I pulled the exact same stats. I started trying to look for quarterback runs against this team and found there was not a lot of it over the course of the year. Yes, it's been effective, but same things that you saw when you looked at that there. Now, from the Baltimore perspective, they're 3-0 with Lamar Jackson, but as we talked about last week and as your numbers uncover, he hasn't been as good as Joe Flacco this year, especially as a passer. Do we think that there's any chance that Flacco plays in this game?
I think there's a chance that they play Flacco a little bit. I think that they want Kansas City to not know who's going to play so that they have to prepare for both. And I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a little bit of both. And I mean, I agree. I think that for making the playoffs this year, I still think Flacco is the better choice. But for the future of the franchise, I think Jackson is the better choice. My guess is it's still going to be mostly Jackson. I think that there has been a changing of the guard, but I wouldn't be surprised if they bring in Flacco for some plays.
Yep, should be really interesting. Looking on the other side of the thing, the Chiefs' pass defense, we talked about their run defense. Their pass defense is usually viewed as a weakness, and that's fair to say. Opposing quarterbacks have a rating of 107 against them, which makes the Chiefs' pass defense rate 22 in the NFL in that regard. However, at home, they've performed surprisingly well. Their rating against is the best in the league at home. They allow just a 77 quarterback rating. Their pass rush rates also reflect a team that loves playing at home, and we talked about their great home field advantage a little bit earlier. At Arrowhead, they're second in sacks per home game, sixth in sack percentage, and third in pressure percentage in the NFL. Well, on the road, they're 12th, 13th, and 24th in the same categories. Right now, they're on pace for home field throughout those AFC playoffs, and it could be really important for them when we look at how it affects their pass defense and that performance.
The other thing I'll say about the Chiefs' pass defense is it's been much stronger against outside receivers than it has been against slot receivers, tight ends, and running backs. So I wouldn't be surprised to see big games here from like a Mark Andrews, the Ravens tight end, or Hayden Hurst, one of the Ravens tight ends, passes to the Ravens running backs. The Kansas City, their pass defense itself is not that bad when it comes to like the downfield stuff to the outside receivers. It's just that the pass rush hasn't been as good and the inside stuff hasn't been as good.
Finally, in this game, we talked a lot about running backs don't matter and running backs don't matter, Twitter and all those opinions. We're going to find out if Kareem Hunt matters to the Chiefs over the next month and then into the playoffs. We should get a really good picture of how important he was to their success. I think they're making the bet that they can do it without him, and I'm proud of them for making that choice. Curious to see how it goes over the rest of the year. In Pittsburgh, it's been interesting. We thought this step from Le'Veon Bell to James Conner was going to be the issue. Turns out Conner filled in really nicely, but without Conner, it's been the Steelers that have struggled. So it's not been that running backs don't matter. It's been that James Conner matters. So we'll find out that about Kareem Hunt.
Yeah, well, I guess, the funny thing about this game is Baltimore is a big argument for running backs don't matter Twitter because Gus Edwards is an undrafted free agent and Alex Collins was picked up off the scrap heap and Dixon was like a 4th or 5th round pick or something. So, that's a team that's done a running game without any highly drafted running backs. Even Kareem Hunt wasn't highly drafted. What was he, a 3rd, a 4th?
3rd round pick, yeah. A little bit more investment in Kareem Hunt there, but yeah, all those guys that are running the ball for the Ravens, though I like the way some of them play, especially Alex Collins, none of those guys are contributing in the passing game, which I think is what running backs are going to get paid for in the modern
Right, Mel, that makes it interesting this week because Kansas City is so poor covering running backs in the receiving game, but Baltimore's running backs aren't used much in the receiving game, so, which wins, the movable object or the resistible force?
On that note, we will sign off. Any recommended reading this week, Aaron? Anything for the people to check out?
If you want to see about a running game that plays really well, check out the new Film Room column on Football Outsiders about the Denver running game. Really interesting with Denver, a rare offense that's doing it with the run. They're 2nd running but 20th passing, and yet that's created a positive offensive DVOA that's actually now in the top 10. Denver is, once you adjust for opponent, Denver is really good. It's kind of a shock.
Check us out on Twitter at sportsinfo_SIS and at FB Outsiders. And as always, you can get a free trial to the SIS Data Hub by logging on to sisdatahub.com and creating an account. We'll see you next week. Have a great weekend, everybody.